People are routinely taught that the rock layers of the earth are billions of years old. This assumption is called Uniformitarianism, or the idea of slow, gradual changes over eons of time. Yet the rock layers we see today contain overwhelming indications that they were laid down recently and rapidly. We'll look at some of this convincing and yet easy to understand evidence. Coming up on today's edition of Origins, The Rocks Cry Out with Bruce Malone. Hello and welcome to Origins. I'm Ray Heiple. It's an honor to be your host today. During this program, we showcase interesting guests who present evidence from science, along with other important facts, validating the truth of creation and the accuracy of the Bible. Today's guest, Bruce Malone, earned a degree in chemical engineering with 27 years' experience as a research leader. In 2008, he became the executive director of Search for the Truth Ministries. This organization distributes Bible-affirming creation materials to students and prisoners internationally, giving away hundreds of thousands. Bruce speaks on the scientific evidence supporting creation at schools and churches around the world and has authored 7 books on this subject. Welcome to the show, Bruce.
Thank you, Ray.
We are glad to have you with us again.
Well, I'm here to talk about rocks, and I'll try to make it interesting.
The rocks cry out. Let's see what that means.
Well, you know, as Jesus was coming into Jerusalem that last week of his life here on earth, he said, if the people stop praising me, and I think the implication of acknowledging who he is, the very rocks will cry out. And I think they are. They're telling us that we have a creator, and the Bible's view of earth history is the correct one.
How do we see that in the creation, the rocks crying out?
Well, to understand that, we're going to have to get into what the world is teaching us about where those rocks come from. And let's just jump right into that. You know, students, as they go to natural history museums and textbooks and movies and so on, whenever they even hear the word fossil mentioned, they connect it with evolution. Millions and even approaching 1 billion years of one animal slowly dying and getting buried, and the layers building up deeper and deeper and deeper. And they're in just enormous fossil beds, you know, like you see here, with just bone after bone after bone just packed together all over the earth. And they're trained that, well, that took millions of years for those to form.
I remember learning that in school. Fossils take millions and millions of years.
You don't find that anywhere in the Bible. You do find something in the Bible that talks about a key event in earth history, and we'll come back to that. To understand what is the truth, first you have to understand the very nature of, well, how did those fossils get there? You see, when something dies, when a tree dies and it falls down in the forest, it doesn't turn into a rock. It doesn't turn into a fossil. If you bury your dog in the backyard and you come back 10 years later, there may be a few bones left, and 100 years later, even those will be gone. They don't turn into rocks. In the 1800s, there was an estimated 100 million buffalo roaming around on the Great Plains states in America. Buffalo hunters came and they literally wiped them out, shooting buffalo after buffalo, skinning them and leaving their bodies to just lay there. There's not a single buffalo fossil. So to form a fossil, it has to be buried rapidly. It has to be buried deeply. You have to have water permeated with minerals flowing past it, and you have to keep away oxygen and microorganisms, or else everything disappears. Fish, when they die in a fish tank or in a lake, they don't turn into fossils. So our conclusion as we're looking for the truth should be, if we don't see something happening today and yet the rocks are full of it, something very different had to have happened in the past.
So we admit that there are all these fossils, they're there, but we differ on how they got there, why they're there.
We differ from what the world, which leaves God and leaves the Bible out of their thinking, is teaching as the explanation for where those rocks and fossils came from. Now, so there's these two different explanations. The other couple things I want people to understand, and these are observations and they're known facts of science, fossils don't take millions of years to form. And here's an example. In the 1920s, they had a mine over in Australia. They shut it down because the prices of things were fluctuating and the depression was happening. They reopened it in the 70s, 50 years later. A miner had left his hat just laying down there. It was a leather hat. 50 years later, it had turned into solid rock. In 50 years, hat. Not millions of years. Well, I like to call it OSHA's original hard hat. But it's solid rock. Every molecule of felt and leather has been replaced by calcium and silica and minerals.
And that's what we mean by a fossil. The biological material is gone. It's stone now.
It can be an imprint, or it can be the actual bones or the body structure that's been replaced by minerals.
So that hat's as much a fossil as a bone that we find that they say is millions of years old.
So that's fossils. Meanwhile, we see enormous sedimentary rock layers across the earth. I mean, this is a picture of strata layers, horizontal flat layers of rock. You have a white sandstone above and a darker colored sandstone below. There's places where it's 20,000 feet, 4 miles of rock that formed underwater. Sedimentary means it was formed from sediments. The individual particles of sand or silica or mud or shale, they came together, were packed down underwater, and turned to a rock layer.
So if there's sediment, water was there before.
Exactly, exactly. And nobody denies this, whether you believe in the long time periods or a biblical viewpoint. Now here's the classic view of evolution. Over time, plants wash into the ground, sediment, rivers carry it into the ocean level rises and rises, and it traps things. So the further down you dig, if you're looking for what's down in these rock layers, and you find something up high, you say, well, that was buried recently. Down further, things were buried longer ago. Down further, they were buried much, much longer ago. And paleontologists will line them up. Deep down, we tend to find ocean creatures, shellfish, shale, coral. Further up, we'll tend to find fish. Further up, we'll tend to find land animals, and so on. And it's interpreted as one turned into the next, that turned into the next, that turned into the next. Now, that's exactly what the father of modern geology did. His name was Charles Lyell. Every geology student hears his principle that studying the processes of the present, slowly rivers and rain takes sediment down into the ocean and forms new layers in the ocean. Slow changes today, over millions of years, created the rock layers and the fossils of the earth. So the present's the key to the past. What the Bible would have us know is that it is enormous, catastrophic events of the past that makes the present rock layers look the way they do. And that's what we're going to look at. We're going to contrast this view of slow, gradual, millions and millions of years created fossils and rock layers versus what the Bible says. There was a world-covering, total restructuring of this entire planet flood about 4,500 years ago. It would have ripped up all the land surfaces. It would have redistributed the sediment. It would have washed stuff into the ocean. First things to be buried would have been clams, trilobites, coral, stuff deep in the ocean. As things changed, fish died, went extinct, were carried. They would have been buried higher up. Land animals would have been buried higher up, all within a few-year period. So deeper things aren't that much older. They were just buried first. Two completely different viewpoints, same rocks, same fossils, different views of how they got there.
So either the present is the key to the past, or the past is the key to the present.
Exactly.
Okay.
So how do we know which one is true? Let's look at some of the evidence for the worldwide flood. Without acknowledging the flood, if you leave it out of your thinking, you are guaranteed to misinterpret those fossils because they would have formed rapidly during that flood. If you just assume there's never been a flood, you look at the Grand Canyon, it's natural you would think it took huge periods of time, but only because you've left the flood out of your thinking. It would have ripped up entire land surfaces and redistributed them across the planet in flat horizontal layers. Tsunamis sweeping across entire continents would have scoured them flat, leaving these flat surfaces. All of the plants, all the trees, everything that's alive is being ripped up and then being buried in huge mats of vegetation, turning them into coal layers. And as the water, almost a year later, Starting 7 months into the flood up to a year later, the land continental surfaces are rising, the ocean basins are sinking. That water rushing off the land would have created enormous river valleys. And there would have been an ice age following the flood because the oceans were warmer, more evaporation. It would have come down as snowfall. So that is the model we get when we read the Bible and assume, well, maybe it means what it says. Maybe this was a real event of Earth history. Now, here's the evidence that supports it. And I'm just going to give 5 examples. Soft tissue found in dinosaur bones, in those rock layers. Sediment layers that are actually bent and folded without being broke. Fossils that are polystrata. In other words, a strata is a rock layer. Poly means many. So something that shoots up right through multiple rock layers, connecting them all through time. Massive extinctions of an animal called a nautiloid in the Grand Canyon. And lastly, leaves that are so fresh, the color and the smell is still there in a fossil bed out in Idaho called the Clarkia fossil bed. So very briefly, let's just take a look at a few of these. The most stunning one is soft tissue that was found inside of a Tyrannosaurus rex bone in Montana. The researcher was a researcher named Dr. Mary Schweitzer. She came out with her report in 2005, caused a fury of controversy throughout the scientific community because you couldn't have a bone laying in the ground for 65 or more million years and still have soft, stretchy tissue inside. Blood cells, blood vessels. I mean, here's a picture from her report of the kind of stuff she was seeing. I mean, right here, here's a piece of collagen that when you stretch it, it would snap right back. Inside of these blood vessels, we've actually found red blood cells and DNA fragments. Now, we know how fast DNA disappears. We know how fast proteins disappear. It is scientifically impossible that these could still be there if these dinosaurs were buried millions of years ago. Now, here's an interview by the researcher who found this soft tissue. I'd like you to listen to her words. Now, she still believes in evolution, but she's explaining what she found.
Is that amazing to find this kind of soft tissue in a fossil this old? And what can the soft tissue really tell us?
Well, it's very amazing. It's utterly shocking, actually, because it flies in the face of everything that we understand about how tissues and cells degrade.
And one of the exciting things about this discovery, correct me if I'm wrong, is the fact that this stuff was fossilized as it was. It's 70 million years old. You don't expect to find soft tissue, do you?
That's the exciting part for me. I've always been very intrigued by how things change in going from a living being to part of the rock record. And like I said, a lot of our science doesn't allow for this. All of the chemistry and all of the molecular breakdown experiments that we've done don't allow for this.
I just want to stop right there. Listen to what she said.
Yeah.
I want that ringing in folks' ears. All of our chemistry, all of our molecular breakdown experiments don't allow for that tissue to be there. That's what we know, but it is. That means those dinosaur bones can't be millions of years old.
And that's the simple answer, but they don't want to give that because that destroys their...
Well, because that means those rock layers can't be millions of years old. Yeah. The only answer left is that they were laid down recently. What happened on this planet that could have ripped up the whole planet, buried enormous fossil beds, including dinosaurs, in a relatively recent time period? The flood of Noah, about 4,500 years ago. Let's go to the second example. We find folded sediment in the mountain ranges all over the earth. Now, these sediment layers were laid down horizontally as waves filled with sediment washed across continents, and slow down they would drop their load of dirt and sand and mud and sediment, and it would form a horizontal layer. The Bible says in the book of Psalms that the mountains rose up as the ocean sank down in the book of Psalms. That is an event in earth history near the end of the flood. Those layers would have been relatively soft as they were being shoved up into the current mountain ranges, the Rockies, the Himalayas, the Alps, and so on. This is one mountain range out in California. You'll notice here's a sediment layer. It would have been laid down flat, and then it bends and curves back up again, and there's a break right here. Here's a close look at it. Now, evolution would say those sediment layers formed, and 20 million or 50 million years later, another one forms, and 100 million years later, another one forms. So it's laid there turning to solid rock. And it's only in relatively recent history, in the last 20 to 50 million years, the mountains were pushed up. Well, if you take a solid rock and you bend it, it will snap. And even if you have a layer of rock that's so constrained that when you bend it, it's got nowhere to go, it will compress on the inside and stretch on the outside. And yet these layers are the same from top to bottom. There's no indication of an expansion and a contraction. Everything says it was bent while it was still soft. So if it was laid down and within a year the mountains were shoved up, it would be like shoving mud around.
So the science that we have would say this clearly happened quickly.
This happened quickly while it was soft.
But because we have to hold on to our evolutionary millions and millions of years, we have to say, no, it didn't.
They ignore the data, say, well, this is a mystery, we'll figure it out someday. You see, it's not science against the Bible. It's not science against faith. It's one viewpoint of reality in the past versus another viewpoint of reality in the past. The biblical viewpoint fits the data much, much better. I mean, here's folded sediments in the Canadian Rockies. Here's folded sediments in England. Here's more of it in Denmark, more of it in South Africa. I love this one. I took this picture on the way to Alaska. Look at these sediments. They were laid down flat. You couldn't lay sediment down in a thin line on the side of a hillside.
Trenches. It's unbelievable how pronounced they are.
That is the pushing up and down the entire earth happened during the flood. And the same thing in the Himalayas. You know, here's these folded sediments, all pushed almost vertical on the entire Himalaya mountains. Third example, we find things shoving up right through multiple sediment layers. Here's a coal seam down here, right here. Here's a limestone layer from here to here. And then there's another coal seam up at the top. Here's a tree that goes up through all of them. Limestone had to have formed in ocean water filled with calcium carbonate. Coal formed on land, you know, or a washed mat of vegetation that was compressed and then formed underwater. It could have happened that way. How do you have a tree sticking up through there while an ocean comes and goes?
Yeah, how does the tree not decay, get destroyed, wash away while all of this forms around it over millions of years?
It could never happen. Another example. This sandstone, which has multiple columns at this national monument, shows that fluidized sand that couldn't have laid there for 10 million years had to have formed layer after layer. And if that happened here, it's happened all over the earth.
Bruce, you're going to have to hold on right there. We have to take a break. This is really fascinating stuff. I hope you'll stay with us and be back right after these messages. Welcome back to Origins. We're talking to Bruce Malone, who's been sharing about how the rocks cry out. Bruce, the rocks really are crying out that there is a God.
Well, they don't talk, Ray, but they have to be interpreted. And we have the freedom as human beings to interpret them correctly or interpret them incorrectly. And we should always start with what has God told us is the history of the past, and then find out. And we will confirm it's true.
Have we any other examples that you could show us?
Two of my favorites. Let me talk first about the Grand Canyon. Everybody has seen pictures, I believe, of the Grand Canyon, or many people have visited it. I mean, it's a mile deep with layer after layer after layer of rocks coming up through it. And as you look at that, one of the most distinctive layers is called the red wall limestone. Now, limestone is acknowledged as having been formed underwater. It's about 600 feet deep. And it's above it and below it are sandstone layers that we are told have formed on dry land. Dr. Steve Austin, he has a PhD in geology. He made a very, very unique find in that red wall limestone. He studied it and found out that, first of all, as you trace it, it's thousands of square miles into 4 different states: Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico. And at the very center of this 600-foot thick layer, he found a massive extinction of an animal called a nautiloid. These animals, I'm going to trace the outline, they're like an ice cream-shaped cone shell. Here's what we believe the creature looked like. It's now extinct, but it's a squid that lived inside of a hard cone-shaped shell in the ancient oceans of the earth before Noah's flood. No one had discovered this before, and he was surprised. He always seemed to find them at the very center of this 600-foot layer. But more significantly, he went all over these 1,000 square miles into 4 states. Wherever that sediment layer was exposed, he showed that statistically, these shells were all lined up in the same flow direction. He also showed that in a large, massive catastrophe filled with lots of sediment, very large creatures like these shells, they would be oriented near the center of the flood flow, and the shells would be oriented in the same direction. So what you have is a 600-foot thick layer of lime that basically grabbed and captured all these nautiloids as it's flowing along and buried them in a rock layer during a massive catastrophe flood flow event. And this is one of the most distinctive, well-known layers of the Grand Canyon. It did not form over millions of years of slow, gradual settling. It formed during a massive world-scale catastrophe. And the same can be said of the sandstone layers above and below. They can be shown to have been formed during water flow catastrophes, not in some dry desert somewhere. So layer after layer of the Grand Canyon confirms that all of it is a catastrophic event over a short period of time. Now here's my favorite, because I was actually here to see this. In Idaho, there's a town called Clarkia, and south of that town, there's a huge rock layer that's been exposed, and it's filled with literally millions, and I think potentially billions of perfectly preserved plant leaves. Now in this fossil bed, and you see the cliff behind me, this is the cliff face, and there's just layer after layer after layer after layer, especially down here into the shale, of packed together plant leaves. They found 140 different tree species, and they're not fossilized. They've just been compacted and decayed. When you break them open, you can still smell organic smells, and the colors are still present. It's like if you were to rake up a bunch of leaves in the fall and let them just sit there and get covered with snow and be uncovered in the spring, you smell this very distinct rotted smell. That's what they smell like. And yet when you uncover them, some of them are still orange or red or yellow, even some greens present, which means the chlorophyll in their photosynthesis mechanism is still present. And then they rapidly decay. The color disappears when exposed to sound. With them, we find fish and sponge fossils. Now, some of these trees are tropical. Some of them only live in the north. Some of them are pine trees. Here's some pictures of some of these, by the way. This is a magnolia tree, grows in south. Here's a leaf from a poplar tree, grows more in the Midwest. Here's oaks, which grow everywhere. That's a leaf that's been extracted from the shale. It's not a fossil. The cells are still there. You look in textbooks, they will say this bed formed 16 million years ago, because they track it based on the time they need for evolution to have
all those
supposedly
layers,
happened. The layer above, the layer below,
yes.
Stated as a fact in the textbooks. And yet, when the researchers started looking, they still found DNA in those fossils. By the way, here's a thread off of a technical site, and you'll see the same thing in textbooks. The fossil bed in Idaho contains exquisitely preserved 15 million year old leaves sandwiched between rock with their original red, yellow, and browns. So they just say, oh, well, that just happened.
The organic material you can still smell, you can still see, and yet you have to deny your senses.
Now, here's the stunning discovery. A friend of mine, Stan Lutz, who lives in that area, he was out there when the University of Idaho researchers were there with their graduate students. And he said, so have you tested these leaves for DNA? And they said, oh yeah, there's still DNA fragments there. Now we know every 500 years, half of DNA disappears. That's a known scientific observation. So, looking at this chart, if in half of it is gone, 50% of it's gone, that would be 521 years. When you're down to a fourth, that's about 1,000 years. When you're down to a 16th, it's about 2,000 years. 400th and 1/500th would take somewhere between 4,200 and 4,700 years. What that says is for that much DNA to be left in those leaves had to have been buried somewhere around 4,500 years ago.
If I take the Bible literally in the genealogies and the time frames, Noah's flood would have happened about 4,300 years ago, 4,400 years ago.
Right in that time frame.
Bruce, I want to thank you for being on the show.
It's been a pleasure.
And I thank you for joining us. Is the Earth billions of years old, or is it thousands of years old? What do the rocks say? That is, when we examine the layers of the Earth according to the scientific laws, we see that the layers have been laid down recently and rapidly, just as the Scripture says. It just goes to show you again that we know what the Bible says is true, and the proof really is all around you. If you enjoy Origins, we sure could use your help to keep this Creation TV program on the air. Your support, both prayerfully and financially, make a big impact. Let's work together and reveal how awesome our Creator really is. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching this edition of Origins. For a DVD of this program, you can order online or send a $12 donation to cover shipping and handling, and write to Origins, program number 2101, Cornerstone Network, Wall, Pennsylvania 15148.
This presentation was made possible by the faithful prayers and financial support of you, our Cornerstone family.